There is a version of the Cold War that most people carry in their heads, and it is wrong. Not wrong in its broad outlines, not wrong in the names it remembers or the dates it assigns to certain collapses and certain agreements, but wrong in its texture, wrong in the feeling it leaves behind. Wrong in the way it suggests that two superpowers spent 4 decades staring at each other across a chessboard, making deliberate moves, exercising judgment, and ultimately choosing restraint. That version is a story built for retrospect. It is a story that knows how it ends. And because it knows how it ends, it smooths over the moments when the ending could have been entirely different. It removes the static from the transmission. It edits out the equipment failures, the mistranslations, the officers who fell asleep at their posts, the computers that detected phantom missile launches, the submarines that lost radio contact for days at a time, and the men who sat alone in underground chambers with launch keys in their hands and no way to verify whether what they were being told was real. The Cold War was not a long peace interrupted by proxy conflicts. It was a continuous near disaster managed through bureaucratic procedure, institutional silence, and a kind of disciplined not knowing that allowed the people inside the machine to keep functioning. The men who ran it, on both sides, understood that if they looked too directly at what they were actually doing, if they followed any single thread of logic all the way to its terminus, the whole system would become psychologically unbearable. So they did not follow the threads. They followed the procedures instead. They filled out the forms. They filed the reports. They attended the briefings and accepted the classifications and trusted that someone, somewhere, at a level above their own clearance, had thought through the implications and arrived at a position that made sense. Most of the time, no one had. Most of the time, the system was running on its own momentum, sustained by the assumption that it was being supervised, when in fact, it was supervising itself. This is the story of what happened inside that system. Not the missiles, not the summits, not the famous moments of visible confrontation that ended up in the history books and the documentary films. This is the story of the invisible architecture. The part that was never meant to be seen, the part that in many cases has still not been fully declassified, the part that was designed to function without human intervention, without human judgment, and in some configurations, without human awareness. This is the story of a war that was never declared but was constantly rehearsed, and of the people who disappeared inside it, not always because they were killed, but because the system required their disappearance in order to keep functioning. The word spy carries a romanticism that the actual practice never justified. In the literature of the Cold War, in the films and the novels and the memoirs written decades later when the writers had been granted permission to remember selectively, the spy is a figure of individual agency, a person who makes choices, who operates in the gap between official positions, who knows things that governments pretend not to know and does things that governments pretend not to have ordered. That figure existed in isolated cases, in specific operations, in moments when the human element was irreducible. But the larger reality of Cold War intelligence was institutional, procedural, and in many respects, automated. The spy who crossed a border was almost always the terminal point of a much longer chain. A chain that began in a committee room, or a budget allocation, or a signals intercept processed by machinery that had no idea what it was doing or why. And the person at the end of that chain was often the least informed member of it. When someone vanished after crossing a border during the Cold War, the disappearance was rarely the result of a single catastrophic failure. It was almost always the result of a system that had been producing small failures for months or years, each one absorbed, classified and filed away, each one generating a report that was read by someone who passed it up the chain, where it was read by someone else who decided it did not rise to the level of requiring action. By the time the disappearance happened, the machinery had already processed it. There was already a form for it. There was already a protocol. The person was already, in the administrative sense, a category rather than an individual. And categories do not require the kind of response that individuals require, because categories do not have families waiting for them, or at least The bureaucracy was designed to behave as though they did not. To understand how that bureaucracy was built, you have to go back to the years immediately following the Second World War, when the United States and the Soviet Union found themselves in possession of something neither had fully anticipated: near total dominance over the post-war world, and no shared framework for exercising that dominance without destroying each other. The alliance that had defeated Germany was not a friendship. It was a temporary convergence of survival interests, and by the time the guns stopped firing in Europe, the convergence was already dissolving. What replaced it was not peace, but a kind of structured antagonism, a set of rules and rituals and tacit understandings that allowed two incompatible systems to occupy the same planet without immediate collision. The intelligence apparatus on both sides grew out of that structured antagonism, and it grew in ways that its founders did not entirely intend and could not entirely control. In the United States, the Office of Strategic Services, which had run wartime intelligence operations, was dissolved by President Truman in 1945, partly because Truman was suspicious of concentrated intelligence power, and partly because the OSS had accumulated a level of institutional authority that made civilian administrators nervous. What replaced it was the Central Intelligence Agency, established in 1947, and the National Security Agency, which grew out of earlier signals intelligence work and was formally established in 1952. These organizations were built on the premise that the Soviet Union represented a permanent, existential threat that required permanent, institutionalized response. That premise shaped everything about how they operated, including the ways they handled the people they sent across borders and the ways they handled those people's disappearances. On the Soviet side, the architecture was different in structure but similar in function. The KGB, established in its final form in 1954 after several reorganizations of earlier security services, was simultaneously an intelligence agency, a secret police force, a border control organization, and a mechanism for internal political surveillance. It had a scope and an integration into the Soviet state that had no precise American parallel, though the FBI's domestic intelligence function provided a rough approximation. The KGB's Foreign Intelligence Directorate, the first chief directorate, ran networks of agents in Western countries, recruited assets inside Western governments and militaries, and maintained a counterintelligence apparatus designed to identify and neutralize Western agents operating inside Soviet territory. When an American or British or West German intelligence officer crossed into Soviet-controlled territory, they were entering a system that had been specifically designed to find them, and that had been processing the information that would lead to their identification for months before they arrived. The border itself, in the Cold War geography of Europe, was not a line on a map. It was a zone, a layered system of observation and detection that began miles before the physical frontier and extended miles beyond it. The Soviet approach to border security was shaped by the historical experience of a state that had been invaded repeatedly from the West, and that maintained a deep institutional paranoia about the permeability of its boundaries. The East German border with West Germany, which became the most heavily fortified and most symbolically significant frontier of the Cold War, was not simply a wall and a fence and a minefield. It was a surveillance infrastructure that included watchtowers with overlapping fields of observation, acoustic sensors embedded in the ground, tripwire systems connected to automatic weapons, a cleared death strip maintained with herbicides to ensure there was no cover for crossing, and a system of border guards operating on protocols that had been designed specifically to eliminate individual discretion. The guards did not decide whether to fire. The system decided. The guards were the mechanism through which the system expressed its decision. That elimination of individual discretion was not accidental. It was a design principle that reflected a particular understanding of how human judgment functions under stress, and that understanding was shared in different institutional forms by both sides. The Cold War was a machine that had been built to distrust human judgment because human judgment was slow, inconsistent, subject to fear and sympathy and error, and capable of being manipulated. The machine was faster, more consistent, and could not be appealed to. This was presented as a feature. The people who built the machine presented it as a feature. What it actually was, in practice, was a system that could generate catastrophic outcomes with a procedural smoothness that made them feel inevitable rather than chosen. The early years of aerial reconnaissance over Soviet territory illustrate this dynamic with particular clarity. Beginning in the late 1940s and continuing through the 1950s, the United States conducted a series of reconnaissance flights over Soviet territory that were, by any legal or diplomatic standard, acts of war. These flights were authorized at the highest levels of the American government, conducted in full knowledge that they were illegal under international law, and classified at a level that prevented them from being acknowledged even within the intelligence community beyond a very tight circle of clearance. The pilots who flew these missions were briefed on the technical objectives of each flight. They were not briefed on the political calculations that had determined that the risk of an international incident was acceptable. That calculation had been made somewhere above them, in a room they had never entered, by people whose names they did not know. When Soviet air defenses shot down one of these aircraft, the standard procedure was denial. The United States would issue a cover story, usually involving weather research or navigational error, and the Soviets would play along with a version of the same fiction. Because both sides understood that the alternative, an open confrontation about what the flights actually were, would require each government to acknowledge capabilities and intentions that they preferred to keep ambiguous. The pilots who were shot down and survived entered a different kind of system. They were processed by Soviet intelligence, interrogated according to protocols that had been developed over decades of managing captured foreign agents, and held in facilities whose existence was officially denied. Their families were told, in carefully worded official communications, that the aircraft had been lost under unclear circumstances, that search and rescue operations were ongoing, and that the government was doing everything possible to determine what had happened. Everything possible in this context meant nothing that would compromise the classified status of the program. The families were not lying exactly. They were being managed. The U-2 program represents the most documented version of this dynamic, but it was not the most extreme version. The U-2 shootdown of May 1960, when Francis Gary Powers was captured after his aircraft was hit by a Soviet surface-to-air missile over Sverdlovsk, became public because the Soviets chose to make it public, because Khrushchev calculated that the political value of exposing American overflights outweighed the intelligence value of keeping Powers' capture quiet. That calculation was unusual. In most cases, both sides preferred silence, and silence was maintained, and the people inside the silence simply ceased to have official existence. There were reconnaissance programs that preceded the U-2 and that operated under even tighter classification. The RB-47 and its predecessors flew the periphery of Soviet airspace, and in some cases well inside it, gathering signals intelligence, photographic intelligence, and electronic order of battle data. Several of these aircraft were shot down. Several of their crews were killed or captured. The official American position in each case was that the aircraft had been engaged in routine training or research and had strayed into Soviet airspace due to navigational error. The actual circumstances of these incidents were classified for decades. In some cases, the full details have still not been released, not because the technical information is still sensitive, but because the political decisions that authorized the flights were made by individuals whose historical reputations are still managed by the institutions they represented. And the institutions have a continuing interest in the version of events that depicts their conduct as measured and responsible. The signals intelligence infrastructure that fed these reconnaissance operations was itself a system of enormous scale and extraordinary opacity. The National Security Agency's relationship with its British counterpart, the Government Communications Headquarters, had been formalized in a series of agreements beginning with the UQSA Agreement of 1946, which established a framework for sharing signals intelligence across a network that eventually included Australia, Canada, and New Zealand. This network, which became known as the Five Eyes Arrangement, processed an enormous volume of communications intercepts from Soviet and Warsaw Pact sources, and the processing was done by machinery that the operators were not always in a position to fully understand. The analysts who worked with the output of this machinery were trained to interpret patterns, to recognize signatures, to categorize and prioritize. They were not trained to evaluate the political consequences of the conclusions they reached, because that was someone else's function, someone above them in the chain, and the chain was long enough that by the time a piece of intelligence reached the level where political consequences were being evaluated, it had passed through so many layers of processing and interpretation that its relationship to the original signal was highly attenuated. This is the structural context in which the stories of individual agents and individual disappearances must be understood. The person who crossed the border was the visible human element of a system that was mostly invisible and mostly inhuman. That person had been recruited, trained, briefed, equipped, and inserted into a framework of operations that had been running long before they arrived, and that would continue running after they were gone. Their disappearance was not a disruption to the system. It was, in a bureaucratic sense, anticipated by the system. There were procedures for it. There were forms. There were protocols for notifying next of kin, protocols for managing the public record, protocols for deciding how much of the truth could be acknowledged and in what form and to whom. The recruitment of agents who would be sent across borders was itself a process that illustrates the peculiar moral logic of Cold War intelligence. The people recruited for this work were almost never the heroic volunteers of popular imagination, people who stepped forward out of ideological commitment and were accepted into a brotherhood of purpose. They were more often people who had been identified as useful by a process of institutional assessment, people who had the right language skills, the right background, the right combination of desperation and adaptability, and who had been approached at a moment in their lives when the offer made sense in a way it might not have made sense at another time. The approach was rarely direct. It began with a series of social interactions that seemed casual, that seemed to have nothing to do with intelligence work, and that were in fact carefully calibrated steps in a recruitment process that the target was not supposed to recognize as such until they were already committed enough that withdrawal felt complicated. The people who conducted these recruitments were professionals who had been trained to understand human vulnerability, not in the clinical sense of psychological diagnosis, but in the practical sense of knowing what a person needed and how to position an offer so that it appeared to provide it. A person who needed money would be given money initially as a gesture, as a loan, as a gift, framed in a way that did not require acknowledgement of what it was. A person who needed validation, who felt their abilities were not being recognized by their current employer or their current social position, would be given validation, would be told that people at a very high level had noticed their work, had been impressed, had specifically requested that this conversation take place. A person who was isolated, who had lost connection with their home country or their family or their community, would be given the experience of belonging, of being brought into a circle of people who understood the world in the same way they did, who shared their frustrations and their perspectives, and who operated according to values that the person had already been subtly encouraged to believe were superior to those of the mainstream culture around them. By the time the recruitment was complete, by the time the person had agreed in some form, explicit or implied, to do what was being asked of them, they had also been maneuvered into a position where the agreement was very difficult to retract. Not impossible. People did retract. People had second thoughts and went to counterintelligence services and reported what had happened, or went silent and hoped the problem would go away, which it usually did not. But the architecture of the recruitment was designed to make retraction costly, not primarily through threats, though threats were available as a last resort, but through the creation of complicity, through the gradual escalation of what the person had already done, so that the first act of full cooperation seemed like a natural extension of everything that had preceded it, rather than a line being crossed. The training that followed the recruitment was in many ways more revealing of the system's logic than the recruitment itself. The people who were being prepared to cross borders and operate in denied territory were taught skills, language skills, tradecraft, technical competencies related to whatever specific intelligence gathering function they were expected to perform. But they were also being conditioned, in ways that were not always explicitly named, to accept a particular relationship to information and to authority. They were told what they needed to know for their specific task, and they were told it in a form that was designed to minimize the number of connections they could draw between their task and the larger operation of which it was a part. This was called compartmentalization, and it was presented as a security measure, which it was, but it was also a mechanism for maintaining institutional control over people who, if they understood the full picture, might make different decisions about their participation. The people who crossed borders into Soviet-controlled territory in the early Cold War years were operating in conditions of extraordinary isolation. Once they were inside, they had no reliable means of communication with the organizations that had sent them. The communication protocols that had been established before insertion were often compromised before they were ever used, sometimes because the networks they were supposed to connect with had already been penetrated by Soviet counterintelligence, sometimes because the technical equipment they carried was detected by Soviet signals monitoring, and sometimes simply because the protocols were based on assumptions about the operational environment that turned out not to be accurate. The Soviet counterintelligence services were extraordinarily effective at identifying and neutralizing Western agent networks during this period, and they were effective for reasons that were not always apparent to the Western intelligence agencies that were losing people. The most significant reason was penetration. The KGB had recruited assets inside Western intelligence agencies, including inside the CIA and British intelligence, who were providing detailed information about operations as they were being planned. The agents who were inserted into Soviet territory in the late 1940s and early 1950s were in some cases being walked into traps that had been prepared weeks or months in advance. They were arriving in locations where reception committees were already waiting for them, and the reception committees were not the resistance networks they had been told to expect. The full scope of Soviet penetration of Western intelligence was not understood at the time, and it was not understood in large part because the institutional response to evidence of penetration was to classify the evidence rather than to follow it to its conclusion. When an agent network was rolled up, when people stopped making contact, when messages went unanswered, the default institutional explanation was operational failure, human error, bad luck. The alternative explanation, that the operation had been betrayed from within, required a level of internal suspicion that the organizations were not structurally prepared to sustain. Pursuing that explanation meant investigating the people inside the institution, which meant treating colleagues as potential enemies, which meant introducing into the institutional culture exactly the kind of paranoia that the Soviets were actively trying to induce through their penetration operations. The result was a kind of willed blindness, a decision to accept operational losses as the cost of maintaining institutional cohesion, a decision that in retrospect allowed the penetrations to continue much longer than they should have. Kim Philby is the figure whose name is most associated with this dynamic in the British context, but focusing on any single individual obscures the systemic dimension of the problem. Philby was one member of a network of ideologically committed Soviet assets who had been recruited at Cambridge in the 1930s, who had entered the British establishment, and who had spent decades providing the Soviet Union with intelligence that compromised operations, exposed agents, and shaped British and American policy in ways that served Soviet interests. The network operated for as long as it did not because the security services were incompetent, but because the social and institutional structures of the British establishment created conditions in which certain kinds of suspicion were not available. The class background that made Philby and his associates trusted was the same class background that made them unexaminable. The institutions that should have been questioning them were staffed by people who had gone to the same schools, belonged to the same clubs, and operated within a social framework in which the kind of loyalty being questioned was axiomatically assumed to exist. When the truth was finally established through a combination of defector information, counterintelligence analysis, and the kind of persistent, unglamorous archival work that intelligence history is actually built on, the institutional response was damage assessment, a technical process of determining what had been compromised and what the consequences had been. The human dimension, the agents who had been sent across borders and had not returned. The people who had been processed by Soviet counterintelligence as a direct result of Philby's information was addressed in a separate compartment, in documents that were classified at a level that meant the families of those people would not know, for decades, what had actually happened. There is a particular quality to the grief that comes from not knowing. It is different from the grief of confirmed loss, not lesser, not greater, but different in its structure, in the way it occupies time. The families of agents who vanished in Soviet-controlled territory spent years, in some cases decades, in a state of suspended uncertainty that the institutions responsible for their relatives' disappearance were not only unable to resolve, but actively maintained. The official communications they received were calibrated to keep them in a state of managed not knowing, to acknowledge enough that they did not feel abandoned, but never enough that they had something definite to respond to. This was not cruelty in the conventional sense. It was procedure. It was the procedure by which institutions manage the human costs of operations that cannot be acknowledged. The geography of the Cold War's disappeared was not confined to Soviet territory. The networks of intelligence activity extended through Eastern Europe, through Asia, through the Middle East and Latin America and Africa, through every region where the contest between American and Soviet power expressed itself in the lives of specific people doing specific things in specific places. Each of these regions had its own version of the border crossing, its own version of the disappearance, its own version of the institutional silence that followed. The documents that would allow a complete accounting of these disappearances are distributed across archives that may never be fully opened, in languages that require specialized expertise to read, in filing systems that were designed to make certain things findable and other things not. The Korean War, which began in 1950 and ended in an armistice in 1953, was a theater of Cold War intelligence activity that has been particularly resistant to full documentation. The conflict involved not only the visible military confrontation between United Nations forces and North Korean and Chinese forces, but an extensive covert dimension that included agent insertions, guerrilla operations, psychological warfare programs, and signals intelligence activities whose full scope was not publicly acknowledged at the time, and in some respects has not been fully acknowledged since. The prisoners of war taken during the Korean conflict became a subject of particular institutional concern because some of them were held by Chinese forces who were actively interested in extracting intelligence about American capabilities, and because the treatment of these prisoners included techniques that the American government found deeply uncomfortable to acknowledge. The return of prisoners after the armistice did not resolve the question of what had happened to all of them. There were men who were acknowledged as prisoners by Chinese and North Korean authorities and who were never returned. There were men whose names appeared on prisoner rosters compiled by neutral observers who did not appear in subsequent repatriation lists. The institutional response to these discrepancies was to classify the discrepancy reports and to conduct the negotiations for additional repatriations in a framework that prioritized diplomatic progress over individual accounting. This was presented as a pragmatic necessity, as the only way to achieve any resolution given the constraints of the political situation. It was also a choice to accept a certain level of ambiguity about individual fates in exchange for a certain level of political convenience, and it was a choice that was made by people who were not in those prisoner camps in favor of objectives that were not the welfare of the people who were. The question of what the American government knew about prisoners who were not returned, and when it knew it, and what it did with that knowledge, became a recurring theme of Cold War accountability that extended well beyond the Korean context into the Vietnam War and beyond. The institutional patterns established in the early Cold War, the classification of uncomfortable information, the management of families through carefully calibrated official communications, the prioritization of diplomatic and intelligence objectives over individual accounting were durable patterns. They did not change because the war changed. They persisted because the institutions that implemented them persisted, and the institutions persisted because they were performing functions that successive administrations found useful, regardless of the moral questions those functions raised. The signals intelligence dimension of the Cold War added a layer of complexity to the disappearance problem that has only partially been addressed even in the post-Cold War period of partial declassification. The National Security Agency and its predecessors processed an enormous volume of communications related to the fate of American personnel in Soviet and Soviet-aligned custody, and much of that information was classified at a level that prevented it from being shared with the families of the people it concerned, or with the congressional committees that were nominally conducting oversight of the intelligence programs. The classification was justified on the grounds that revealing the information would compromise intelligence sources and methods, which was in many cases true. The intelligence value of knowing that a particular communications channel was being monitored depended on the Soviets not knowing it was being monitored, and sharing information derived from that channel with families or congressional staff created unacceptable risks of exposure. This was a genuine dilemma, not a pretext. The people who made these classification decisions were not, in most cases, indifferent to the fates of the individuals whose information they were protecting. They were making calculations about the long-term value of intelligence capabilities against the immediate value of accountability, and in the institutional framework they were operating within, the long-term intelligence capabilities routinely won that calculation. The families received official communications that acknowledged nothing of what the agencies actually knew. The agencies continued to receive intelligence that was filed and processed and absorbed into the larger picture of Soviet capabilities and intentions, and the individuals whose fates that intelligence described remained in the administrative category of unresolved cases, generating periodic review requests that were processed and returned to file without resolution. The development of nuclear weapons and the delivery systems for them added a dimension to the Cold War disappearance problem that went beyond individual agents and individual fates. The people who designed, built, and deployed these systems were themselves subjects of extraordinary security scrutiny because the information they possessed was considered so sensitive that their personal lives, their movements, their associations, and in some cases their mental states were matters of institutional concern. The security protocols that surrounded nuclear weapons programs created a form of managed existence for the people inside them, a form in which the boundary between the person and the institution had been effectively dissolved. These people had not disappeared in the sense of being lost or imprisoned, but they had, in a meaningful sense, ceased to be fully autonomous individuals. They existed within a system that defined the parameters of their lives in ways that they had agreed to, but had perhaps not fully understood when they agreed. The Soviet nuclear program operated under conditions of even more extreme institutional control, partly because the Soviet security state had a much longer experience with the management of technical populations for strategic purposes, and partly because the historical context of the Soviet program, which was built in the shadow of the purges and the gulags, and the systematic destruction of entire categories of people, created a particular kind of compliance that was less voluntary than its American counterpart. The scientists and engineers who worked on Soviet nuclear weapons were not simply employees who had signed secrecy agreements. They were people who understood, at a level that did not require explicit statement, that the alternative to useful compliance was a form of disappearance that was considerably less comfortable than the one their American counterparts might face. The nuclear arsenals that both sides built during the Cold War were not simply weapons. They were the physical expression of a logic that had permeated every other aspect of the conflict. A logic that said that sufficient destructive capacity, properly organized and properly communicated, would prevent the destructive capacity from ever being used. This logic, which became known as deterrence, was elegant in its abstraction and deeply strange in its application. It required that both sides maintain the credible capability to destroy civilization, and it required that they communicate this capability to each other clearly and continuously, while simultaneously maintaining ambiguity about the specific conditions under which the capability would be exercised. The ambiguity was not a failure of the system, it was a deliberate feature. Absolute clarity about the conditions for nuclear use would have allowed the other side to calibrate its actions precisely to the threshold, to approach it as closely as possible without triggering a response. Ambiguity meant the other side had to maintain a margin of caution, had to stay further back from the edge than the edge actually required. The people who managed the nuclear arsenals on both sides were embedded in command and control systems that were designed to balance two competing requirements. The requirement that the weapons could be launched quickly enough to survive a first strike, and the requirement that they could not be launched accidentally or without proper authorization. These two requirements were in fundamental tension because the measures that ensured quick launch capability, pre-delegation of launch authority, reduced time requirements for authentication, simplified procedures for ambiguous situations, all reduced the barriers to accidental or unauthorized launch, and the measures that reduced accidental launch risk, multiple authentication steps, centralized control, long authentication times, reduced quick launch capability. The resolution of this tension was not a solution but a compromise, a set of procedures that were somewhat too slow for optimum survivability and somewhat too fast for optimum safety, and that therefore combined the partial costs of both compromises without the full benefit of either. The close calls that resulted from this structural tension were numerous, and many of them are still not fully documented in the public record. The ones that are documented are sufficient to establish the pattern. In 1960, a test of the ballistic missile early warning system radar in Thule, Greenland, produced a signal that was interpreted by initial analysis as a massive Soviet missile launch. The signal was caused by the radar reflection off the moon, which had risen in a position that had not been anticipated in the system's design parameters. The incident was resolved before any alert was transmitted up the chain, but it established that the detection systems on which the entire deterrence edifice rested were capable of generating catastrophically misleading information under conditions that had not been anticipated by their designers. In 1979, a computer tape containing a realistic simulation of a Soviet nuclear attack was mistakenly loaded into the operational computers at the North American Aerospace Defense Command, generating alerts that caused bomber crews to move to their aircraft and missiles to be moved to higher readiness levels before the error was identified. The error was identified not by the system, but by a human analyst who noticed that the satellite detection systems were not showing the thermal signatures that would accompany a real launch. The system had generated an alert for a massive nuclear attack that was not occurring, and the mechanism that prevented response was not a system safeguard, but individual human attention. The Soviet equivalent of these incidents was the Petrov case, which became public only after the Cold War ended. In September 1983, the Soviet early warning satellite system detected what appeared to be 5 American intercontinental ballistic missiles launched from the United States. The officer on duty, Stanislav Petrov, had a responsibility to report the detection up the chain of command as a real attack, initiating the response protocol. Petrov did not make that report. He concluded, based on reasoning that went against his training and the formal requirements of his position, that the detection was a false alarm, and he reported it as such. His reasoning was that a real American first strike would involve hundreds of missiles, not 5, and that the confidence level indicators in the detection system were inconsistent with a genuine detection. He was correct. The system had malfunctioned, producing false positive detections caused by sunlight reflecting off high-altitude clouds in a way the satellite sensors had not been designed to distinguish from missile exhaust. Petrov's decision saved, potentially, tens of millions of lives or more, and it was made in violation of his training, his protocols, and the institutional logic of the system he was embedded in. The system had produced a result that required a human being to override it. and the human being available at that moment happened to have the combination of experience, confidence, and independent judgment required to make that override. Had a different person been on duty, a person who followed the protocols exactly as written, the story of the Cold War might have ended differently. The casualness of this, the absolute contingency of it, the fact that the continued existence of civilization depended at that moment on which specific individual happened to be sitting at a specific console in a specific building outside Moscow, is not a reassuring feature of the deterrence architecture. It is a revelation of how thin the margin actually was. The protocol that Petrov violated was not poorly designed. It was designed in accordance with the logic of the system. A logic that said that the individual officer's judgment was the weakest element in the chain, the element most susceptible to hesitation and error, the element that needed to be constrained by procedure rather than given latitude. That logic was correct in most cases. Most of the time, the protocol produced better outcomes than individual judgment would have. But the case where individual judgment was required, the case where the protocol would have produced catastrophe, did occur. And the system's ability to survive it depended not on any feature of the system, but on the specific human being who was sitting inside it at the specific moment when the system failed. The geography of near misses extends across the entire span of the Cold War, from the early 1950s to the Soviet collapse, and the documentation of these near misses is still incomplete. Incidents that were classified at the time of occurrence have been partially released through Freedom of Information requests, through presidential library declassifications, through the work of historians who have spent decades navigating the bureaucratic procedures for accessing restricted material. But the releases are partial. They are partial because the documents released are the ones that the releasing agencies have decided can be released, which means they are the documents that reveal the minimum necessary to satisfy legal and political pressure for transparency, while protecting the maximum amount of information that the agencies consider still sensitive. The picture that emerges from this process is real, but incomplete. Like a photograph developed in the wrong chemical, showing shapes and outlines, but not the full resolution of what was actually there. The Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962 is the most documented of the Cold War near misses, and its documentation is itself instructive about the limits of the Cold War record. The basic outline of the crisis is well established. Soviet missiles discovered in Cuba, American demand for their removal, a 13-day confrontation that appeared to bring the world to the edge of nuclear war, a negotiated resolution that removed the missiles in exchange for American pledges not to invade Cuba, and a secret agreement to remove American Jupiter missiles from Turkey. What is less well established in the public understanding of the crisis is the submarine dimension, the set of events occurring underwater and out of sight of the decision-makers in Washington and Moscow that, had they proceeded differently, would have ended the crisis before the diplomatic resolution was reached. 4 Soviet Foxtrot-class submarines had been sent to the Caribbean as part of the Soviet response to the crisis, each carrying a nuclear torpedo with a yield equivalent to that of the Hiroshima bomb. The submarines were operating under conditions of extreme stress. They had been at sea for weeks. Their crews were exhausted, their air conditioning had failed, temperatures inside the submarines were reaching intolerable levels, and they had been subjected to days of harassment by American anti-submarine warfare forces that were using practice depth charges to force them to the surface for identification. The submarine commanders had authority to use their nuclear torpedoes under certain conditions, and those conditions were being approached. On one of the submarines, designated B-59, the situation reached the point where the commander, Valentin Savitsky, concluded that war had already begun and ordered the preparation and firing of the nuclear torpedo. The political officer on board, Ivan Maslenikov, concurred with the decision. Under the protocols in place, the decision of both the commander and the political officer was sufficient authorization for launch. What prevented the launch was the presence on board of a senior fleet officer, Vasily Arkhipov, who was serving as flotilla commander and whose authorization was also required under a specific protocol that had been put in place for this deployment. Arkhipov refused to authorize the launch. After a confrontation that witnesses described as physically intense, he persuaded Savitsky to surface and communicate with Moscow before taking any action. The sequence of events on B-59 is known from the accounts of participants who spoke about it publicly only after the Cold War ended, and from records released by Russian archives in a partial and still incomplete form. The full documentation of what happened on those submarines during the crisis remains restricted. What is known is sufficient to establish that the prevention of nuclear use in that situation depended on a specific institutional provision, the requirement for flotilla commander authorization that had been included in the deployment orders for reasons that had nothing to do with nuclear safety, combined with the personal judgment of a specific individual who was present by institutional accident rather than design. The survival of the world, in those days in October 1962, was the product of a bureaucratic provision and a man's refusal, neither of which had been specifically calculated to produce that outcome. The Arkhipov incident was not known to the American decision-makers managing the crisis in real time. They were managing a crisis whose submarine dimension they understood only partially, and the aspects they did not understand were precisely the aspects that came closest to producing a catastrophic outcome. Kennedy and his advisors, the group known as XCOM, that was managing the American response, were operating on the basis of intelligence about Soviet capabilities and deployments that was accurate in some respects and significantly incomplete in others. The most dangerous gaps in their knowledge were about the psychological state of Soviet forces under operational stress, about the conditions under which Soviet commanders had authority to use nuclear weapons, and about the specific capabilities of the weapons those commanders had access to. This asymmetry of knowledge under crisis conditions was not unique to the Cuban Missile Crisis. It was a structural feature of the Cold War confrontation. Both sides were making decisions based on assessments of the other side that were derived from intelligence processes that, however sophisticated, were operating under conditions of fundamental opacity. The Soviets did not know what the Americans were really willing to do. The Americans did not know what the Soviets were really willing to do. Both sides had developed analytical frameworks for predicting the other's behavior, frameworks derived from the study of doctrine and history and the interpretation of signals and communications, and those frameworks were sometimes accurate and sometimes not, and there was no reliable way to know in advance which was which. The intelligence officers who worked to reduce this opacity were working in a system that had its own relationship to truth, a relationship that was shaped by institutional incentives that did not always align with the production of accurate assessment. An intelligence analyst who told their superiors what the evidence actually suggested was doing their job correctly. An intelligence analyst who told their superiors what the evidence suggested, when what the evidence suggested was that the current policy was wrong, or that the current threat assessment was inflated, or that the enemy was not as capable as the current budget allocation assumed, that analyst was doing something that the institution did not reward and sometimes actively penalized. The production of intelligence in the Cold War was not simply a technical process of collecting and analyzing information. It was a political process, embedded in institutional structures that had their own interests and their own relationship to the information they were managing. The figures who crossed from one side to the other, the defectors and the double agents, and the people who for various reasons ceased to be reliably located on either side of the Cold War's conceptual boundary, were managing exactly this kind of institutional complexity. They were people who understood, from the inside, how the machinery functioned, what it actually did as opposed to what it claimed to do, and they were people whose knowledge was simultaneously enormously valuable and deeply threatening to the institutions that needed to assess and contain it. A defector who knew too much about the failures of their former institution was useful as a source of intelligence about that institution's capabilities. They were also dangerous as a potential source of information about their new institution's collection methods and analytical practices, because what they had observed in their former institution was often the reflection of their new institution's operations back at them. The management of defectors on both sides was an exercise in controlled exploitation and managed risk, and the people being managed were often aware of this, which created a particular dynamic in the relationship between the defector and the institution receiving them. The defector had information that was wanted, the institution had resources and security that were needed, but the exchange was never equal, because the defector's information had a shelf life and the institution's need for security did not. And as the information aged, the defector's value declined. And as the defector's value declined, the institution's interest in their welfare declined with it. This trajectory was not always explicit, but it was felt, and the most sophisticated defectors understood it and tried to manage it, holding back information, releasing it gradually, trying to extend the period of their institutional value long enough to establish a stable position in their new environment. The stories of defectors who did not manage this successfully are scattered through the Cold War archives in forms that require active recovery. The official records describe outcomes, the dates of deaths and the causes provided by forensic examination, the findings of investigations that were conducted by agencies with interests in particular conclusions, the official statements that closed cases without resolving them, the human texture of these stories, the fear and the isolation and the negotiations conducted in small rooms with people who had files on them, and the institutional authority to make their lives comfortable or very uncomfortable. That texture appears in memoirs when memoirs were permitted, in oral histories taken decades later by researchers, and in the occasional document that was released with less redaction than its authors might have intended. Yuri Nosenko's case is among the most extensively documented and still most contested of the Cold War defector cases, and it illustrates with unusual clarity the way the institutional management of individuals could become entirely disconnected from any concern for those individuals. Nosenko was a KGB officer who defected to the United States in 1964, shortly after the assassination of President Kennedy, and who claimed, among other things, to have personal knowledge that the KGB had not been involved in the assassination. His defection came at a moment of particular sensitivity because the CIA was already running an investigation into the possibility that Lee Harvey Oswald had been a Soviet asset, and Nosenko's information was directly relevant to that investigation. The CIA's response to Nosenko was not to evaluate his information straightforwardly. The response was shaped by the institutional conviction of James Angleton, the head of the CIA's counterintelligence function, that the Soviet intelligence services had deliberately sent Nosenko to deceive the United States, to provide false assurances about the Kennedy assassination, and to identify American intelligence methods and assets. This conviction was not based on a specific intelligence failure attributable to Nosenko. It was based on Angleton's broader theory of Soviet intelligence operations, a theory that postulated that the Soviets had achieved such comprehensive penetration of Western intelligence that almost any apparent asset or defector might be a controlled provocation. This theory was unfalsifiable in its strongest form, because any evidence against it could be interpreted as evidence that the Soviets were cleverly constructing a false picture, and any evidence for it was already expected. Acting on this theory, the CIA subjected Nosenko to a program of hostile confinement and interrogation that lasted almost 4 years. He was held in isolation, in conditions designed to be psychologically destructive, subjected to interrogations using techniques that were intended to break his story or break his resistance, or produce some kind of visible failure that could be used to classify him definitively as a provocation. The program did not produce the confession or the contradiction that Angleton's faction was looking for. What it produced eventually was a reassessment conducted after Angleton's influence had waned that concluded Nosenko was probably a genuine defector and that his information was probably substantially accurate. The reassessment did not undo the 4 years of confinement. It did not address the institutional decision-making that had authorized the program. It resolved the case file and returned Nosenko to a version of normal life. with a financial settlement and a consulting relationship with the CIA that gave the institution continued access to whatever knowledge he still possessed. Nosenko survived, which distinguishes his case from others. The cases that are harder to document are the ones where the person did not survive, or where survival took a form that made subsequent public accounting very difficult. The Cold War produced a number of deaths that were officially explained as suicides or accidents, and that have been the subject of persistent doubt, not in every case as conspiracy theorizing, but in some cases as legitimate historical inquiry into the gap between the official explanation and the available evidence. The institutional response to this doubt has been consistent. The official explanation is maintained, the documents that would allow independent assessment remain classified, and the passage of time gradually moves the cases from active controversy to historical footnote. The defection pipeline also ran in the opposite direction, from west to east, and this dimension of the Cold War is significantly less documented in the Western record because Western institutions had less interest in examining it. Americans and British and West Germans and others who chose to cross to the Soviet side carried with them knowledge that the Soviet intelligence services received and processed and absorbed into their operational planning, and the consequences of those crossings expressed themselves in the compromised operations and the agents who did not return, and the intelligence assessments that turned out to have been based on false premises. The names that became public, William Martin and Vernon Mitchell, Edward Lee Howard, Robert Hansen, represent a fraction of the cases, the fraction where the crossing was known and confirmed. The cases where the crossing was suspected but not confirmed, where the individual disappeared into a gray zone of institutional suspicion, were handled through procedures that generated their own kind of institutional silence. The East German intelligence service, the Stasi, operated one of the most comprehensive surveillance and intelligence systems of the Cold War, and its records, which were partially preserved after German reunification in 1990, have provided a level of documentation of Cold War intelligence activity that is unusual in its detail and in some respects uncomfortable in what it reveals. The Stasi maintained files on approximately 6 million East Germans in a country with a total population of approximately 16 million. It operated a network of informal informants, the Inoffizielle Mitarbeiter, who numbered in the hundreds of thousands at the program's peak and who were recruited and managed using techniques very similar to those used by Western intelligence services to recruit foreign assets. The difference was scale and purpose. The Stasi was primarily an instrument of internal control applied to the Stasi's own population, and the files it generated document the granular texture of a surveillance state applied to daily life. The Stasi's Foreign Intelligence Division, the Hauptverwaltung Aufklärung, was a genuinely sophisticated intelligence service that achieved penetrations of West German government, military, and intelligence institutions that are still not fully catalogued. Its most celebrated success was the placement of Günther Guillaume as a personal aide to West German Chancellor Willy Brandt, a penetration that contributed to Brandt's resignation when it was discovered in 1974. But Guillaume was not an isolated case. The HVA had recruited a network of assets in West Germany whose full extent was established only after the Stasi archives became available, and even then only partially, because the division's chief, Markus Wolf, had arranged for the destruction of significant portions of the archive before reunification. Wolf was one of the most skilled intelligence officers of the Cold War, and his career illustrates the degree to which the conflict was sustained by individuals whose competence and professionalism existed in complete separation from any moral assessment of what they were doing. Wolf ran his foreign intelligence operations with a sophistication that his Western counterparts acknowledged, in some cases openly, as superior to anything they could match. He recruited agents not through crude blackmail or coercion, but through the patient construction of relationships, through the offer of ideological connection to people who felt alienated from the materialism of West German society, through what was described as a commitment to a genuinely different future. The people he recruited believed for the most part that they were doing something meaningful. They were providing information to a state that claimed to represent a principled alternative to the system they were embedded in, and the fact that the state they were serving was itself a system of extraordinary coercion and control was something that they found ways to not fully know. This capacity for managed not knowing was not unique to Wolf's assets. It was a feature of Cold War service generally, on both sides. The people inside the institutions, whether they were case officers running networks, analysts processing intelligence, technicians maintaining systems, or administrators managing the bureaucratic infrastructure, sustained their functioning by maintaining a selective relationship to the full implications of what they were doing. This was not hypocrisy in the simple sense. It was a psychological adaptation to conditions that, if fully acknowledged, would have made functioning impossible. The people who ran covert operations knew, in some abstract sense, that the operations had human costs. They did not, as a rule, dwell on those costs in ways that interfered with the operations. The people who built and maintained the nuclear arsenals knew, in some abstract sense, what those arsenals would do if used. They did not, as a rule, maintain a continuous relationship with that knowledge while they were doing their jobs. The knowledge existed in a separate compartment, available for access when required for specific technical or planning purposes, but not continuously present in the form that would have made the work psychologically impossible. The psychiatric dimension of Cold War service was itself a subject of institutional management. The intelligence services on both sides understood that the work they were asking people to do had psychological costs, and they developed mechanisms for managing those costs that were themselves classified and that were aimed primarily at maintaining operational effectiveness rather than the welfare of the individuals involved. The CIA's psychological assessment programs, which evaluated candidates for covert operations roles and monitored the psychological condition of serving officers, were aimed at identifying people whose psychological stability was sufficient for the work and at identifying people who had become destabilized to the point where they represented security risks. The care for the individual was secondary to the care for the information the individual possessed. The intersection of Cold War intelligence activity with other domains of institutional power, the military, the nuclear weapons establishment, the signals intelligence infrastructure, the policy apparatus, created a system of such complexity that effective oversight was structurally difficult. The congressional committees that nominally supervised the intelligence agencies received information that was selected and framed by the agencies themselves in a process that gave the committees the experience of oversight without the substance. The oversight problem was recognized by people inside the system, and periodic reform efforts were made, but the reforms generally strengthened the process of information provision to oversight bodies without fundamentally changing the relationship between what was provided and what was actually happening. The oversight bodies received better briefings about a smaller portion of the actual activity than they had received previously, and this was reported as a reform. The Vietnam War expanded the scale and ambition of American covert operations to a point that ultimately became visible in ways that the Cold War intelligence architecture was not designed to absorb. The Phoenix program, which was intended to disrupt Viet Cong political infrastructure through a combination of intelligence gathering, capture, and in many cases assassination, operated on a scale and with methods that could not be contained within the normal classification structure. The scale was too large, the operational contractors too numerous, and the South Vietnamese government too unstable as a security partner for the program to remain fully compartmented. When it became public, through journalistic investigation and congressional testimony, the institutional response was management, a series of reforms and renamings and redefinitions of scope that preserved the essential function while reducing the political exposure. The people who operated the Phoenix program and who were later required to account for their activities in congressional testimony were managing the same kind of documentation problem that characterized Cold War intelligence generally. The records of specific actions were distributed across multiple bureaucratic systems, some of which had been specifically designed to make reconstruction difficult. The individuals who made specific operational decisions had done so under conditions where the chain of authorization was deliberately attenuated, where the written record of approval was minimal, and where the operational norms of the program had evolved through practice rather than explicit written guidance. Establishing what had been authorized and by whom and on what basis was technically possible in some cases and genuinely impossible in others, not because the records had been destroyed, though some had been, but because the authorization structures had been designed to produce a certain level of unattributable ambiguity. The intelligence dimensions of the Vietnam War extended far beyond the Phoenix program. The signals intelligence infrastructure supporting the war consumed an extraordinary proportion of the National Security Agency's operational capacity, and the intelligence produced by that infrastructure was subject to all the analytical and political pressures that characterize Cold War intelligence production generally. The Gulf of Tonkin incident, which provided the legal basis for the major escalation of American military involvement in 1964, depended on signals intelligence assessments that subsequent analysis has established were significantly inaccurate, and that were produced and interpreted under conditions of strong institutional pressure toward conclusions that supported the policy the administration was already planning to pursue. The intelligence did not simply fail. It was produced within a system that was oriented toward particular conclusions, and it produced those conclusions, and the consequences were enormous. The signals intelligence record of the Gulf of Tonkin incident was classified for decades after the events, and when the key documents were released, they confirmed the pattern that internal critics had suggested at the time, that the intelligence supporting the claimed second attack on American destroyers was ambiguous at best, and that the ambiguity had been managed rather than honestly represented. The people who managed that ambiguity were not acting in bad faith in the simple sense. They were acting within an institutional culture that had developed specific norms for how ambiguous intelligence was handled when policy decisions were pending, and those norms prioritized supporting the policy over representing the uncertainty accurately. This was not a unique pathology of the Vietnam period. It was a feature of how intelligence was produced and consumed throughout the Cold War. The end of the Cold War, which came through the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, did not resolve the institutional questions that the conflict had raised. It produced a brief period of optimism about the possibility of fundamental institutional transformation, an opening of archives, a reassessment of historical record, a potential accounting for the human costs of the previous 4 decades. That period of optimism produced some real results. Soviet and East Bloc archives were partially opened, allowing historians to reconstruct portions of the story that had been inaccessible. Declassification programs on the American side released significant quantities of previously restricted material. The research infrastructure for Cold War history was substantially improved, but the opening was partial and in many respects strategic. The documents that were released were the documents that the releasing agencies had evaluated and decided could be released, and that evaluation was conducted by the same institutional cultures that had classified the documents in the first place. The most sensitive programs, the ones whose full documentation would require the most comprehensive reassessment of the official narrative, remained restricted. The people who had worked inside those programs and who in many cases understood what the official narrative was missing were bound by their security agreements and by the culture of their former institutions, and they remained, for the most part, silent. The physical infrastructure of the Cold War, the missiles and the warheads and the submarines and the satellites and the listening posts and the dead drop sites and the safe houses, persisted into the post-Cold War world in various states of decay and transformation and continued use. The command and control systems that had been designed to manage nuclear arsenals did not disappear when the arsenals were reduced. They were modified and adapted, and in many cases maintained in forms that continued to reflect the logic of the conflict that had produced them. The doctrine of deterrence, which had been the intellectual foundation of the Cold War nuclear posture, continued to provide the conceptual framework for nuclear policy even after the specific adversarial context that had justified it had dissolved. The people who had been trained to operate these systems, who had spent careers inside the institutions that the Cold War had built, carried the logic of those institutions with them into the post-Cold War period. They populated the national security bureaucracies of the successor states. They staffed the think tanks and advisory bodies and academic institutions that shaped policy debate, and they interpreted the post-Cold War world through frameworks that had been constructed for a specific conflict that no longer existed in its original form. The institutional memory of the Cold War was thus preserved not in the archives, which were partially opened and partially closed, but in the people who were not required to be declassified and who went on making decisions. The disappearances that had characterized the Cold War, the agents who had crossed borders and not returned, the pilots who had flown over denied territory and come down in places their governments could not acknowledge, the prisoners who had been processed by adversarial systems and not released, the people who had worked inside classified programs and who had ceased to exist as public individuals. These disappearances were not resolved by the end of the Cold War. Some of them were partially resolved through diplomatic negotiations, through the opening of archives, through the patient work of historians and investigative journalists who were given access to materials that had previously been restricted. Most of them were not resolved because resolution required institutional acknowledgement, and the institutions had continuing interests in non-acknowledgement that the end of the Cold War had not eliminated. The accounting for the Cold War's human costs, to the extent that it happened at all, happened in a form shaped by the same institutional logic that had produced those costs. It happened in closed meetings between government representatives, in documents that were written and classified in the same bureaucratic idiom that had classified the original operations, in processes that were accessible to the families of the disappeared only through intermediaries who were themselves embedded in the institutions being questioned. The families received, in many cases, more information than they had received during the Cold War itself, because the political calculus had changed and the benefits of limited disclosure now exceeded the benefits of complete silence. But they received information in the form that the institutions providing it had decided was appropriate, which was not the same as the full truth. The Russian successor state to the Soviet Union retained most of the institutional architecture of the KGB in transformed institutional form, and retained most of the institutional culture that had characterized Soviet intelligence. The FSB and the SVR, which inherited different portions of the KGB's functions, operated according to frameworks that were continuous with their Soviet predecessors, and their relationship to the Cold War record was one of selective acknowledgement, the same relationship that characterized the Western services' relationship to their own records. The joint historical projects that produced some of the most significant Cold War scholarship in the 1990s and early 2000s were possible because they served the interests of both sides in specific ways, and they became more difficult as those interests diverged, which happened gradually and then more quickly as the political relationship between Russia and the West deteriorated through the first decades of the 21st century. The nuclear arsenals that both sides had built and that both sides had nominally reduced through a series of arms control agreements remained substantially intact as operational systems. The reductions that the agreements required were real, in the sense that specific weapons were dismantled and specific delivery systems were retired. They were partial in the sense that both sides maintained arsenals that were, in absolute terms, capable of destroying civilization many times over. The arms control process had reduced the scale of the arsenals without fundamentally changing the logic that had produced them, and that logic continued to generate the same institutional imperatives, the same command and control structures, the same early warning systems, the same doctrines of deterrence that had characterized the Cold War. The close calls that had nearly resolved the conflict catastrophically during the Cold War had not produced systematic reforms of the systems that had generated them. Petrov's intervention in 1983 was not acknowledged by Soviet authorities until 1998, and its public acknowledgement did not produce a revision of the early warning protocols that had nearly produced a catastrophic response to a false alarm. The Cuban Missile Crisis had produced some improvements in crisis communication, most notably the hotline between Washington and Moscow, but the fundamental vulnerability, the possibility that automated systems operating under conditions of ambiguous information could generate alerts that human decision-makers would be under extreme pressure to act on in ways that would be irreversible. That vulnerability remained. The strategic environment that emerged from the Cold War was thus one in which the systems built for a specific conflict continued to operate after that conflict had formally concluded, sustained by institutional inertia, by the interests of the organizations that maintained them, by the doctrinal frameworks that gave them meaning, and by the persistent human difficulty of fundamentally revising the premises of a system that had, in its own terms, succeeded. The Cold War had not ended in nuclear war. The deterrent system had apparently worked. This success was interpreted as validation of the system, as evidence that the logic of deterrence was sound, that the arsenals should be maintained, that the institutions should continue, that the protocols and the procedures and the automated responses and the early warning systems and all the rest of the apparatus should be preserved as the guarantee of a continued peace that was, in fact, the guarantee of nothing. The people who had vanished into the Cold War's machinery, the agents and the prisoners and the pilots and the conscripted surveillance subjects and the technical personnel who had been absorbed so completely into classified programs that their public existence had been effectively suspended, those people had been the human cost of a system that presented itself as the defense of civilization. The system had been built on the premise that certain human costs were acceptable in exchange for the prevention of a greater catastrophe, and that premise had been used to justify costs that were never fully accounted for, costs that were managed bureaucratically rather than acknowledged honestly, costs that were absorbed into the institutional record in forms that made them difficult to recover and easy to forget. The catastrophe that the system claimed to prevent had not occurred. The costs that the system had imposed were real, and they were dispersed across the entire span of the conflict, and they settled into the lives of individuals and families in ways that the institutions responsible for them had designed to be untraceable. The Cold War ended. The wall came down. The Soviet Union dissolved. The summits and the handshakes and the arms control agreements and the declarations of a new era accumulated into a narrative of resolution. The systems that had sustained the Cold War did not dissolve with it. They adapted. They found new justifications. They generated new categories of threat that required the maintenance of old capabilities. The archives that would allow a full accounting were maintained in forms that controlled what could be known. The people who understood what the full accounting would contain were bound by agreements and cultures of silence that the end of the Cold War had not terminated. The border remained. Different in some places, reduced in others. But the logic of the border, the logic that said that on one side was the manageable world and on the other side was the place from which people sometimes did not return, that logic persisted in new forms, in new locations, managed by institutions that had changed their names, but not their essential relationship to the information they held.